So as we get towards the end of the second meditation, you see how dense this writing is. There's a whole lot of stuff on every single page. Towards the end of the second meditation, Descartes thinks he has justified the following conclusion, that he can't be sure that any wax exists or any stars or sun or planet Earth exists. He can be sure that he exists. He can be sure something about the nature of his mind, that he's a thinking thing, and that mind includes such things as willing and deliberating and doubting and sensing and imagining. But sensing is not what you thought it was. Sensing is grasping an object by means of your intellect. It's a kind of cognitive capacity. And if you think that you know, for example, the yellowness of the wax or the fragrance of the wax, then your perception is confused, not clear and distinct. You have not done your intellectual work to figure out how things really are. So, as part of his meditative practice, part of what Descartes wants to do is to get clear on what knowledge is and what it is to know something about the world. And his claim is that what common sense or unreflective opinion gives us as a story about how things are is at best half right, maybe even worse than half right, mostly confused. And there's a technical distinction that Descartes makes between, on the one hand, clear and distinct perception, and on the other hand, obscure and confused perception. Sometimes it just talks about it as confused perception. It's confused to think that the wax is yellow. It's confused to think that the apple is red, or that the sulfur, that rotten egg smell, is a characteristic of those rotten eggs themselves, for instance. That's a confused conception of the world. A clear and distinct way of thinking about the world is that these are characteristics of our minds when we experience these things, but when we do experience those things in such a way as to know them, then what enables us to know them is our intellect and not our senses. Now, this is going to be an important thing for Descartes because the distinction between clear and distinct perception and obscure and confused perception is going to be something that he'll bind up in a very interesting way with his theology. So he's going to want to tell us later on, he thinks in later meditations, that he can prove the existence of God. He actually gives two distinct arguments for the existence of God, and he's going to want to say, in light of that, he thinks God exists, and there'll be a connection between God's existence and clear and distinct perception, which we'll get to in just a moment. So, by the end of the second meditation, Descartes thinks he's done a whole lot of work. He thinks he's shown that he exists. He thinks he's shown how things seem to him to be, and that he can know how things seem to him to be, even if he can't be certain about how things actually are. He thinks he's drawn conclusions with certainty about what kind of being he is, as I've said, a being that thinks, that denies, that wonders, affirms, and senses and imagines, and he's also wanted to be clear about what those activities are. And finally, he thinks he's shown what properties, and this is by means of the piece of wax passage, he thinks he's shown what properties external objects would have to have if there were any external objects, or if there are any external objects. They would have to have just characteristics as position in space and time, number, extension, the sorts of quantitative characteristics that a physics can study. And Descartes is, in the process of these meditations, really trying to construct a new scientific method that goes beyond the scholastic doctrines that were pervasive up until his time. And then, really, for 100 years after Descartes' death, there were philosopher scientists around Europe who called themselves Cartesians, and they were very impressed by Descartes' reasoning and the meditations and other things that he wrote, and he thought that, yes, Descartes had developed a new scientific method, much better than what we had before, as a method of finding out not just about ourselves, but about how the world is. So, let me give you a brief glimpse now of Meditation 3. It won't be necessary for us to go into it in detail. I'll be asking you to skim through it, but you won't need to be reading it very closely in the way that we will with Meditations 1 and 2. The crucial thing that you need to understand about Meditation 3 is that Descartes gives an unusual, intriguing argument for the existence of God. Notice that you can understand and appreciate Descartes without having to believe that God exists. There's no requirement for this course that you be a believer. But it is the case that many philosophers in the Western tradition have been believers in some kind of divine being. So to understand them, we want to understand their theological convictions. Descartes says this: I have in my mind the idea of an all-perfect being. I have the idea of a God who's got all possible perfections. And he goes on, I don't think that I could have come up with that idea myself. I don't think that I'm that innovative, that creative, that imaginative. And I don't think it could have been put there by experience, because experience just gives me, at most, information about the finite, limited world. And I don't think my parents, my teachers could have given me that idea. Or if they did, the question would be where they got that idea from. So there's this thing inside me that I can't account for, this idea of God, that I can't account for except on the hypothesis that it was put there by, you guessed it, God, him, or herself. That is to say, Descartes at one point says, maybe just as a painter signs his painting, so too, after maybe what happened is after God created me, God put his signature on it by putting an idea in my mind of God. So Descartes saying, the only possible explanation of the existence in my mind of this idea of God is that there has to have been a genuine God, the greatest conceivable being, that put it there. So that's an interesting and unusual kind of argument that Descartes gives for his theistic conclusion. You don't have to believe it. You don't have to buy that argument, and there are plenty of people who are doubtful of it. But in order to understand where Descartes is coming from, you have to understand his reasoning. The reasoning is the only possible explanation of the existence of this idea that I've got is that it was put there by God, him, or herself. So that's one plank of the kind of overall position that he's going to want to develop. And then something else is important in Meditation 3 as well. It's this. Connect it up with the problem of evil. The problem of evil goes like something like the following. You may well have heard of it before. The problem of evil is as follows. There's a lot of evil in the world, such as suffering, such as malice, such as intentional wrongdoing. Many people, even outside of Descartes, many people have wondered, in fact, countless people have wondered, if there is so much evil, how could God have allowed that evil to exist? After all, God is all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good, omnibenevolent. And wouldn't an all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good being want to minimize as much evil as possible, want to eradicate all evil that's within its power to eradicate? And in fact, many people have given up on their theism that they might have been raised with as children once they looked around and found out about the amount of evil that there was, had given up and just said, forget it. There's no way God could exist and allow this thing to happen. So just imagine someone in 1945 stumbling out of a concentration camp liberated by Russians or by British or American troops and saying to him or herself, I'm glad I survived, but I've seen so much incredible evil, so much incredible suffering, there just can't possibly have been a God that allowed that to happen. Or imagine someone who was suffering under Pol Pot in Southeast Asia back in the 1970s under the Khmer Rouge. And they, again, suppose they die in the process of dying, suppose they're being tortured to death by one of Pol Pot's soldiers, they might say to themselves, this is such unnecessary suffering, what could possibly justify it? I can't see what possibly could. There can't be a God that would allow this to happen. So the problem of evil essentially says there can't be a God that would allow suffering of the sort, magnitude, intensity that we know here on earth. That's the general form of the problem of evil. Theologians and some philosophers have spent many, many years, in fact centuries, trying to figure out how to solve it. We're not going to try to solve it, you'll be glad to hear. But Descartes is aware of the problem of evil, and he makes an innovative suggestion. The innovative suggestion is the following: that error, being wrong about something, is a form of evil. It's not as evil as intentionally causing someone to suffer, perhaps, but it's a bad thing. It looks like the more knowledgeable you are, the more good you have experienced or created or made possible. And likewise, the more ignorant you are, the less you've been able to do that. So Descartes says, well, wait a minute now. If ignorance is a kind of evil, then it would also seem that in general, we think many people who respond to the problem of evil would say, look, evil is man's fault, not God's fault. So when someone decides to eradicate Europe's Jews or to cause genocide somewhere else or to cause just an individual person to suffer, it's their fault, not God's fault. Okay, you might say that. Descartes thinks there might be something to that. He's going to go on and now say, well, likewise, in many cases, when I'm wrong about something, that's my fault. That means I was being sloppy in my calculations or in my experiment or something of the sort, in my reasoning. But now suppose, on the contrary, that I come to a conclusion and I've done my absolute best to get that conclusion right. I've made a 100% maximal effort to be as precise and careful as possible in my reasoning that got me to that conclusion. Descartes' going to want to say, if that's right, then if I'm still in error, it can't be my fault, because I was doing my best. So it could only be the fault of God. But of course, God would not let me fall into error. That would be contrary to God's nature. So Descartes draws a fascinating conclusion here, namely, let's use clear and distinct perception as a kind of code word for any conclusion that we draw that is based on the most careful, precise, rigorous, self-scrutinizing line of inquiry that we're capable of engaging in. So if I clearly and distinctly come to a certain conclusion that so-and-so, whatever the so-and-so is, that the piece of wax is not really yellow or something of the sort, then Descartes is going to want to say, it must be true. God wouldn't let me fall into error in a case like that. So the idea of clear and distinct perception is an important, partly technical, partly theological idea for Descartes. I think it's a fascinating one. It's the idea that if I do my absolute mental epistemic best to come to a certain conclusion, Descartes, let me try it again, God would not let me be mistaken in reaching the conclusion that I do. Therefore, Descartes says, and this is a general rule that he uses throughout the meditations, or at least after he establishes it in the middle of the meditations. As a general rule, whatever I clearly and distinctly perceive to be the case must also be true. If I clearly and distinctly perceive that the piece of wax is not really yellow, then it's true that it's not really yellow. And likewise for many other things that we'll see later on in the meditations.